Hello and welcome to the Point Blank Show. My name is Abhishek. On this podcast, we are about to enter the world of magic and witchcraft, but not as we know it. Joining me today is Dr. Tabitha Stanmore, who has written a fascinating book titled Cunning Folk, Life in the Era of Practical Magic. Thanks a lot, Tabitha, for joining me.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
Thanks. Now, this is a subject which is not really your regular living room topic of discussion. When did you first get interested in the subject itself?
Okay, so I think it's something I've always been interested in. You're absolutely right. It's not something that we sort of talk about very commonly, but I think it is something that's always been there. So I was always really interested in religion, actually, and why people believe what they do and how sort of religions develop and why people get so invested in them. And I realised that actually a lot of the interest and the powerful beliefs that people have around religion can be applied to magic as well, and kind of magic as a belief system is really important and powerful. Yeah, I kind of dove in from there and have never come back out.
Lovely. A long time ago, I remember having read an article in The Economist, and now Google helps me fetch that piece. It's an article from 2000, and it calls magic the second oldest profession, which thrives as the first one. So is it as old as that? How old is magic? From your research, you're a historian, you've done your bit over the years. So when was the first magic trick in the history books?
In the history books, I think, what's the oldest written record we have? The Epic of Gilgamesh. And I think magic appears there. So basically since, the beginning of written record, I would say. Yeah, so it's been around a while. I don't know how long people have been paying for it, and I'm not going to compare it to the oldest profession, but yeah, it's been there a while.
And your website says that you're a specialist in medieval and early modern English magic and witchcraft. I'm reading it out from your site. And I heard one of your other podcasts where you talk about that you wrote a dissertation around male witchcrafts a while ago. If my memory serves me right. Tell us how did you get into it and what was that dissertation about, and your history as well.
Yeah, okay, so I've been thinking about magic and witchcraft since my undergraduate degree, so that was, 15 years ago? And yeah, I did do my undergraduate dissertation on male witchcraft because we have this strong stereotype of witches being female, but in England in the early modern period, so in the 16th and 17th centuries, it was more about 25% of accused witches were male. And I thought, well, that's interesting, nobody's really talked about that. So got into it in that way, and then when I went on to do my PhD, I realised that when I was collecting up all of these examples of male witches, I was mostly coming across men practising different kinds of magic that weren't necessarily scary curses, which we would expect a witch to do. So I thought, well, what's going on with that? So I started collecting more and more examples and realised that a lot of the people that we would call witches now were cunning folk, and that there was a long history that sort of needed to have more attention given to it. So yes, PhD happened from there, and now books.
Right. So PhD, before that, tell me, Tabitha, how did your parents, your relatives, your friends react to the choice of subject that you had? And you would obviously have been quite serious about it, but not sure about folks around you. How did they react?
It depends who you ask. My mum was very supportive. She is really interested in this kind of stuff herself, and she's just sort of very open-minded. So it was very easy to kind of get her on board. I think in an academic setting, it was harder to get people on board a lot of the time because you have real history, which is economic or legal history, and then you have social history, which is a little bit less respected. Then you have magical history, which we're still trying to get respected. It's a bit out there still.
But then was it school? Was it college? When was it that, hey, let me dive deep into this? Something that is not researched enough is what you thought. And, it's not just a passing hobby. You've dedicated a good section of your educational career, or rather education on it. And later now you've got a book out with rave reviews in the New Yorker, in the New York Times and The Economist. So there's a lot of work that has gone in. Do you remember the days when you thought, this is where I'd like to dig in?
I think it was at university. It's not something that was really covered in college or school when I was there, although you can now do an A-level in some UK colleges in the history of the witch trials, so there is that now. But yeah, it wasn't really something that was done until university, and I think in my third year of university is when I first got to take a course in witchcraft, or the history of witchcraft, not spellcasting. It still doesn't really turn up in universities very often. And yeah, I think it's... the reason I'm interested in it is because magic is something which has always been there. As I say, you can find it in most cultures and societies throughout most of our history, and it's a really good way of understanding people And that opportunity to look at people through this lens, I think, gives us a much better insight into history. So for that reason, I don't think I can ever kind of leave it behind, because it's just such a big part of being human. So yeah, that's why I love it.
Can you give a couple of examples, that the part that you talked about it being human, just for a normal listener like me to draw a parallel?
Yeah, of course. So I think one of the most common types of magic that turns up in the period I look at, so as I say, kind of from the 14th century up to the 17th century, is love magic. So casting a spell to get somebody to fall in love with you, or if you're in an unhappy relationship, then make that relationship better or escape that relationship sometimes as well. And that's something which was very, very common back then, because there weren't really any other ways of resolving a bad relationship. And I think, we still get love spells now. You can still buy them on the internet. You can still go to a fortune teller or something like that to find out what's going to happen in your relationship. Or even in my local bookshop, actually, you can buy a love spell. So, that's one of the things that hasn't really gone anywhere, because love is so uncontrollable. It's not something that we can rationalize our way out of, so we still kind of need magic to help us with it sometimes.
And your book, Cunning Folk, Life in the Era of Practical Magic, it does not talk or debate around whether it works or not, magic in itself, but it goes into the cultural references of how it was used and what it talks about human society in different centuries. In that light, what is Cunning Folk? If you can explain, because when you talk about cunning, the first thing that comes to mind is fox, as cunning as a fox. Obviously, in your book, Cunning Folk means entirely different. What is it about? Who are those folks?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Cunning and fox, they definitely go together now, and that's how the word has evolved. In the medieval period, cunning actually meant somebody who was very knowledgeable and often had a hidden knowledge. And obviously that's evolved into something which is a bit more sneaky now. But it was somebody who had advanced knowledge that most people didn't have. And so, yeah, a cunning person, or the cunning folk in general, are people who have a kind of knowledge that other people don't always have and who normally need. So, yeah, I mean, I suppose you could use the word wise man or wise woman as well, or seer or sorcerer or anything like that. But in the period I look at, people were often referred to as a cunning man or a cunning woman, and they'd have all sorts of different skills. They would be able to heal, they'd be able to tell the future or find a stolen item if it had been... And sometimes they'd use magic to do that, sometimes they wouldn't, but a lot of the time they would use magic as part of their kind of toolkit for fixing everyday problems.
And about the point around finding things, whether it's a spoon or somebody losing a piece of cloth, these are things that we take for granted today. Why would you engage in services of a cunning folk or someone who will help you get them through sorcery perhaps? But there is more to it. These were not, you can't, spoon is something that was perhaps a luxury as well back then. That's why they would go about in search for professionals who could help them find stolen objects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's exactly that, as you say. It's the fact that we don't appreciate a lot of the objects we have now because we have so many of them, and they're mass-produced, they're very easy to get hold of, they're quite cheap. And so, if we lose a spoon, we probably don't even notice if we've lost a spoon now. But in the 16th century, if you've lost a spoon, it might be your only spoon. Bear in mind that also forks weren't really used at this point, so your spoon would be your only eating item. Right. And it would be handmade, and it would take a decent amount of time to make. It would be something that you'd have to have the skill of blacksmithing or wood whittling to be able to make, and that would be something which was very valuable. And so, if you only had one or two, then you'd really miss it, and it would cost a lot to replace. And if they're made of something like an expensive metal like silver or sort of steel or something like that, then not even actually sure whether steel was a thing back then. But if it was made of silver, then it could be something that you would pass down to your next generation. It could be sort of something that would be a big part of somebody's inheritance. So you didn't want to lose it, and it would be worth doing a lot to try to find it again.
Right, and the extent to which some of these folks went to look for what they had misplaced or had been stolen is quite something. Tell us about the spoon lady, for lack of a better phrase, that you write about.
Yes, the spoon lady. So her name is Mabel Gray, and in 1637 she lost some spoons, and she lived in London. She lived in South West London. And she ended up travelling all the way across the River Thames down to South London, to quite a sort of dodgy part of South London, to go and consult a cunning woman there. The cunning woman said that she couldn't help because that's not the kind of magic that she specialised in. So then she said, well, if you go back over the river, and bearing in mind it's the River Thames, it's a big river, and it was not very safe to cross depending on the time of year. So it was quite a sort of an undertaking. Oh, I'm really sorry. My cat started yelling at me. I'm just
No worries. Cat is also part of the podcast. We don't have to worry about it. Please continue.
Okay, good. All right, cats. Yeah, so then she crossed back over the river and she goes to sort of central London, and she goes and consults a cunning man there. And the cunning man says, no, actually, I can't do this either. I do specialise in stolen goods, but this is actually a bit too specialised for me. So then he takes her to a third cunning man who doesn't live very far away, but is still a few streets sort of into kind of the depths of London. And then she consults this third cunning man, who eventually says, and it's quite amazing, he says, the spoons are in the house of the man who took the spoons, which is not very helpful.
Yes.
But then this cunning man goes on to say that they will reappear where they had gone missing from. So he sort of says that somehow they will come back. And so, I mean, Mabel Grey probably thought this was all worth it. The record doesn't say whether she got them back or not. I'm hoping that she did. But yeah, I think I plotted it on a map, and it would have been about a 15-mile journey. And she spent, quite a lot of money on getting these back. So clearly these spoons were very valuable to her.
What about detectives and police? When did they come in? Because the cunning folks appear to be doing the job of a policeman here.
Yeah, actually they often were. And that's because, the police force in England wasn't founded until the 18th century. So we're talking about 150 years or so after Mabel was looking for her spoons. Right. And that doesn't mean there wasn't any kind of law and order, but there wasn't somebody who you could report a crime to and it would be investigated. And there definitely wasn't insurance for household objects or anything like that. So she really didn't have anybody else to ask apart from possibly her neighbours. So, Cunning Folk were really sort of filling that gap that the police force would later go on to fill.
Right. And you've written quite a lot, extensively rather, on this subject. And I happened to read a bit about an essay or a paper that you had done called Magic as a Useful Category of Historical Analysis. It's there on the University of Bristol's website. And there you say that you collected over 550 cases of magic use between 1350 and 1650. How do you go about looking for these things, and what did you discover?
Okay, so how did I go about looking for these things? So it's interesting because magic, as I say, it is something which is everywhere all the time, but it's not something which people tended to write about all that often unless there was a good reason to. And that made it quite difficult to find these cases because, I've started thinking of magicians a little bit like dentists. Like, they're very important, and when you need one, you will, hunt one down. But you're not necessarily going to write about them or put it in your diary or, anything like that. So unlike the witch trials, for example, which were sort of written about a lot, cunning folk weren't really, because they were just sort of part of everyday life. So the main places I found these cases were in the church court records, actually, because Christianity was quite concerned about people using magic. And so if you were found to be practicing love magic or something like that, then it was treated as a form of superstition or possibly blasphemy. So practicing religion wrong. And so the church would get involved and sort of say, you've done this wrong, it's not very Christian of you, stop it. Right. And you'd normally just get penance or something like that. It wasn't a harsh punishment, but you would be sort of told not to. So these minor cases, I sort of just went through all of these church court records, which is sort of thousands and thousands of pages, and just sort of picked out every record I could find. And then on top of that, I started looking at people's diaries. We've got a few that survived from this period. And recipe books as well. Recipe books would often would be handwritten, and they'd have a spell just sort of scribbled into the corner or something like that. And so you kind of get an idea of what people were doing with magic through those. And just putting all of these together eventually came up with 550.
Oh, amazing. And what about recipe books and the spell? So what happens there? So it was scribbled there for what reason, you think? And of all places, recipe books?
Because they were useful. So recipe books didn't just used to be about food. They'd have recipes for, different meals in them, but it would also have recipes for medicines, for example. If you had a cough, then you might have a special drink that you would take for that. And spells would often fit into that category as well. It's like something's gone wrong. There might be a useful spell for that, so you'd consult your recipe book and find a useful spell.
at the moment, I would suspect that your cat knows a little more than what we think in terms of
yes.
magic. But what about their standing in society? And by the way, it's absolutely fine. Let your cat be. It's not a hindrance at all.
Oh, thank you.
Absolutely not. No, absolutely.
He wants to go outside. I'm just going to open the door and let him out, and then maybe
Yes, please.
he'll shut up.
Sure. Okay.
It's freezing outside. He'll be back again in 5 minutes.
I hope so. And I hope, because in India, by the way, when a cat crosses the street, I don't know if it's there in the West, it's said that it's inauspicious. You have to, go around it, or you've got to, take another path. So especially if it's a black cat that crosses the street while you are at it. So I don't know the reason behind it, but it's been used enough number of times in Bollywood movies.
Interesting. Yeah, we have the same thing. And unfortunately, my cat is black and he's constantly walking past me. So just constantly cursed, I think.
If it brings something more out of you, like the book, it's definitely not a curse. And coming back to this one, what was their standing in society? In that you had the priests, you had, let's say, doctors, the police in whatever shape or form they were in, and then you had the cunning folk, who would always be relied upon by both crooks and the good guys, because they would go to them, I would imagine, when they didn't have any other solution. So how were they respected? What was their reputation?
I think they had quite a difficult reputation. It wasn't clearly good and it wasn't clearly bad. People high up in the church would say that they were bad because any kind of magic uses demons was the kind of the official Christian line. But lots of people completely disagreed with that because these cunning folk were doing good in their communities. But people who used them, they would justify it by saying, no, they're healers, they're helpful. But then they would also be a little bit scared of them sometimes because they had these powers that nobody else really knew how to control. So there was always that kind of element of risk. Are you asking somebody for help who might then sort of turn around and curse you later? And so it wasn't always sure, basically, of how to deal with them. Interestingly, you mentioned that there were also doctors and priests, and you're absolutely right, there were. But sometimes a doctor or a priest could use magic as well as part of their services. So sometimes in a community you might have a priest who is responsible for blessing people and sort of sorting out funerals and marriages and that kind of thing. But then they might also offer holy water to heal people, or they might be able to consult the stars or use the Bible to cast a spell that would sort of tell somebody's future, or even curse a thief, for example. So sometimes a cunning person would actually also be a priest. And yeah, then it gets really complicated about where their status was and whether they could be trusted or not. Again, the church would say that was a bad thing, but a local priest would do it anyway. And so, where does that leave
those
you?
who are both the cunning folk as well as the role of a doctor, maybe PhDs, just the cunning folk, maybe common graduates, and they were both sought after, because there are a couple of stories in your book where the kind of power that they had is what you write. For example, one of them told someone to blame a guy with a blemish on his face, and that person blindly followed. And there was no, lack of evidence didn't matter. That, that person was assigned blame, and now it is that person's responsibility to prove himself or herself not guilty. So they had some standing as such, for at least those who believed in them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's strange because officially that sort of evidence would not be useful in court, but that didn't change the fact that sometimes it would be very useful in court, and it would be the thing that would drive somebody to press charges. And also, occasionally the judge would also listen to that evidence. So you're absolutely right. They did have they were very, very powerful people in society. It's just that their power was an unofficial one that they had to use quite carefully. Because ultimately, if they did get it wrong, they had no means of protection. Cunning folk, they had to pick their cases carefully, and they had to dispense their advice wisely. Because they were in quite a difficult position.
And did you get to know what kind of methods they used in all the madness to claim to find a missing object, or to get somebody to fall in love or with someone, or to get married? Was it a lot of spells, or some sort of black magic, or did they do a song and dance around it? Is that something that was part of your study? How did they, go about the whole thing? Because if it didn't have color around it, I wonder if it would be as popular.
Yeah, great question. They definitely did have A lot of methods for everything that you just mentioned. So, for example, for a love spell, there's everything from just sort of a drink or a potion that you could drink, and sort of then, you know, the person that you wanted to end up with would just suddenly be completely in love with you. But then there was also an option to summon a demon and get that demon to torment the person until they gave up, basically, and agreed to marry you.
Yeah.
So yeah, very, very different methods. But yeah, it's a lot of the time, especially when it came to finding lost goods or identifying a thief, the processes were often very elaborate, because a lot of the magic would rely on people knowing the magic was being done. Because if somebody has stolen your horse, for example, and if you tell everybody that you're going to go and consult a magician to find the thief of your horse, and then the magician does an elaborate spell in the middle of the town square, the thief might well want to return that horse pretty fast. One method that was used was to line up all of the suspects in a room and get them to eat a piece of cheese. And this would be magic cheese. It would be sort of blessed. And then one by one, everybody would eat this cheese. And if they were able to swallow it, then they weren't guilty. If they choked on the cheese, then they were the thief. And you can imagine in that situation, if you were very nervous, then maybe you wouldn't be able to swallow the cheese, and then you'd be identified as the thief. So yeah, it's partly magic and it's partly psychology, I suppose.
That's trickery, isn't it? And that's very intelligent trickery, where the whole idea is that you don't want to test it. You may as well come ahead and confess. And there is another example like that, if I remember. There is a wall, they draw an eye on it. And what was that about? They drill a hole. If you can talk me through that one as well.
Yeah, so this is a strange one. It doesn't come up that often in England, but it is very common in Greece and Italy as well, I think. But yeah, it's, as you say, the cunning person would draw an eye on the wall, and they would drive a nail right through the centre of the eye. And then they would get all of the suspects to just walk past the eye one by one. And as the guilty person walked past, the idea was that the eye would start to weep. As it cried, then you'd know who the guilty person was. And that is a little bit harder to explain as trickery. I mean, you could have somebody outside sort of pouring water in when the suspect goes past. But if it's a very solid wall, that's obviously not going to work. So the expectation that magic was real and could work was definitely there as well. So it's trickery, but fundamentally believing in magic as well.
Absolutely. And here it all rests on the assumption that the fear of being caught will unearth the person who had committed the crime by himself or herself. That's the whole idea around it. And what else did these cunning folk use their magic for? One was, you said, love life, which was quite predominant. Your book goes on to talk about, revenge or helping people get rich. If you could give a few examples in that realm.
Yeah, so getting revenge, I think, is, again, it's something very human. It's something that you can buy curses on the internet now as well.
Oh, you
so
can?
It's still
I
very
have no
present.
idea. Oh, you
Yeah.
can. Oh goodness. So how does it work? So you go online, you go buy a curse, and then how is the person whom you want to curse the recipient? Did you deliver something in the person's house virtually?
Yeah, I mean, it very much depends on the curse. I mean, I'm not going to recommend this, but you can employ a magician to do the curse for you at distance. So they'll just sort of send a demon or something. Or you can create a curse doll. So I think often we think of them as voodoo dolls. That's not an accurate term for anything outside of West India, but it was very common actually in the period I look at and the modern day to be able to get these sort of dolls made out of wax, and you would take a piece of hair or nail clippings or something else, from the person you intended to curse, and you would sort of stick those into the wax, and then you would just do horrible things to it. Really, you could melt the wax, you could stab it, bury it, whatever, and after a certain amount of time the person would start feeling those effects. And it's really interesting because, again, if we sort of think about it from a psychological perspective, sometimes what people would do is they take these curse dolls and they bury them underneath the threshold of the person they were cursing. And so if you got home one day and you noticed that your porch had been dug up, and so you start digging around in the dirt and you find this doll that's, your curse doll, it probably would have a very strong effect on you. It would be terrifying. I mean, even now, if you knew that somebody wished you that much harm, it would probably have quite a strong effect. So, yeah, that's one method if you want to harm somebody. Not that I'm recommending it, but that's something that people would use.
No, that's interesting you say that, because, in Hindi, the word for curse is shrap. So some of these melodramatic movies, we have that, where an old lady would say, my shrap to you is XYZ, and the other guy might say, please take it back. And that happens in real life as well, where no, you can't do that. You just take that back because that's not going to let me sleep well at night. I may have, been in the wrong, but don't go to that extreme by saying those words, and you have to take that back. So that also happens, whether it's in families or, not so much in friends, but in older families for sure. So yeah, that still continues, whether it's buying a curse online, which I had no idea about, or these things. So that remnant of the past is still continuing in some shape or form today.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, that does not surprise me at all. As I say, I think it's such a human thing, especially if you don't feel like you have any other way of resolving the situation, or if you're just really, really angry, that sort of throwing out that anger at somebody is quite a human thing to do. So yeah, be careful. Be careful of who you upset, and be careful when you are upset.
Absolutely. And another place where I would imagine cunning folk would be employed is to when to cure people, because if the doctors or the powers that be say that, hey, we can't do much, then the last hope, I would imagine, are these. Is that something that would happen a lot?
Yes, absolutely. Healing was much more common than cursing or basically any other kind of magic, because people got sick a lot, and medicine, even sort of the top of the range medicine, wasn't that good, and most people couldn't afford the top of the range medicine anyway. I think in England at this time we had about 5 million people and only 2,000 qualified doctors, so they would only serve the very highest in society. You have a normal person wouldn't be running to a university trained doctor, so they would be relying on family medicine or cunning medicine a lot of the time, and a lot of it probably would have worked, to be fair. A lot of it came from just experience, so it would be particular soups or drinks or particular herbs to eat that would help with some of the symptoms that you were experiencing. And the magic that was added on top of that would have also probably helped a lot, because it would have been very reassuring a lot of the time. So a really common charm that was used was to write out a small prayer or just some nonsense words, actually, or maybe kind of the names of some angels onto a piece of paper, and then tie that up and wrap it around the sick person's neck. And they would just wear that for 3 days until they felt better. Or you could go and consult the fairies, because often if you had a fever especially, people thought that might be caused by fairies. So you could go to a sort of a nearby hill or a kind of mound where fairies were thought to live, summon them, probably give them something to eat and drink, because you always have to be polite to fairies, and ask them for their help. And either the fairies could diagnose and say this is what the issue is and give you a cure, or the fairies would say, okay, well, you've calmed us down now, so we'll actually remove the fever from the person. So there's kind of a process of negotiation, but I'm not going to say how that worked, but I do know that if I believed in fairies and I thought that I had been cursed by a fairy, if I also knew that somebody very trustworthy in my village had gone and spoken to the fairies and told me that they'd gone away, I probably would feel better. And we know that placebo and that positive thinking can really help with healing, even now.
So this is, faith, isn't it? I mean, and we can't really judge or deride any of this, because not much has changed even today. You will find people walking around with amulets. Why? Because some godman in India here, so people with beards, and they give long lectures, and they're considered to be godmen in India. They would have given that to you. And the person in question here could be a vice president at a multinational, but he believes that having that around his neck, or his a ring for that matter, will maybe calm him down, or will bring the best out of his job, or maybe he'll get a new car if he does a couple of things. So that still continues. It's the avatar has changed. It was the cunning folk back then. Today it could be astrologers, again, not to trivialize the whole concept and the vertical or the industry profession, so to speak, but people do. It's all down to faith then.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is down to faith, and as you say, we're not very different today, and a lot of the ways that this would work in the past work in the same way now. So even down to finding your practitioner and who's going to sort of sort these problems out for you, a lot of the time it's still by word of mouth. You want somebody who has come well recommended and is highly regarded and isn't just a travelling salesman. You want somebody who has a strong reputation that you can trust, and that's an important part of the magic. You have to trust that it will work. The person performing the spell has to trust that it will work. Even actually, there's a lovely story from the 14th century of a bishop who goes and visits a local cunning woman, and she is able to do all sorts of magical things, including, like, she makes a leather bag suddenly jump up and start dancing around the room. And the bishop says, "Oh, could I do that?" And she says, "No, absolutely not. You wouldn't be able to do it because you don't believe in this." And the bishop's like, "Well, you have me there. I don't believe in that, so I wouldn't be able to do it." But that idea of faith, both from a religious and a magical angle, it's so important.
Yeah, even today, if something bad is happening in a home, for example, if there are a series of misfortunes, maybe your wallet has been picked, maybe a great grandmother has passed away and it's a joint family, they conduct in Hindi, there is a word called Havan, which, as I look it up, the exact meaning is a fire ritual performed on special occasions. That's what Google says, where you get a priest, you have in the middle of the living room, you'll have some camphor, some wood and ghee, which is clarified butter, and there is a lot of smoke and fire, and the priest will mumble a bunch of prayers. The whole idea is to clean up, or there are a lot of impurities in the house, you clean it up. So that happens. That's one such spin-off of a spell from yesteryears, maybe.
Absolutely, and it makes sense, and I'm sure it makes people feel a lot better once it's happened. That sort of that cleansing, that purification, the exercising of the bad energy. I have no doubt that the house feels better and things start getting easier afterwards. So yeah.
And then how do you react when kids' books, children's books these days? I mean, historically, witches are always the vamps or the villains in the whole thing, and your book suggests that it could. I mean, witches need not always be bad. There are also those with a good heart, and the whole idea is to help the person. So is that unfair, you think, or it's just fun and we shouldn't read too much into it?
I think it depends how it's told, because I think that ultimately magic is morally neutral. It's what you do with it that makes it bad or good. And so long as that is clear, I think that's absolutely fine. Some stories you'll have, a good witch and you'll have a bad witch. And if you have those two sort of forces sort of working against each other, I think that's okay, because you're basically saying that people aren't always good and they aren't always bad, and you need to work out how to be a good person, whether you use magic or not. So yeah, I think it depends on the storyteller.
Right, and in your research, what some of the most bizarre story or magical remedy or charm or whatever that you must have come across that you found was interesting, surprising, amusing, shocking, anything that comes to mind?
Good question. I think there are all sorts, really. Actually, so there's quite a dark one, which again I wouldn't recommend anybody ever try. But there was one to raise a storm that was used in the 50s against the King of Scotland, actually. And it involved taking a black cat and baptising the cat, which is already an upsetting thing if you're Christian, because apparently cats don't have souls, which I think is very mean. But yeah, so you baptise this cat, tie the limbs of a dead man onto the cat, and then just throw it into the sea, and that would raise a storm. And apparently it did raise a storm, which almost sank the king's ship. So that was, I'm not really sure what the theory was behind that one. It just seems a bit
out there. Something that is and your Twitter handle also suggests that magic and witches are not the same. I think it's magic, not witches. Is that your Twitter handle?
Yes, it is, yeah.
And that not every person who practices magic is a witch, is what you also talk about in one of the other podcasts. Yeah. Is there a difference? Is it important for us to know the difference about, who witches are, what they did, what magic was? How has it evolved over the years, if that were a question that you could take a crack at? Magic in the 16th century, from this standpoint of Cunning Folk, technology improved. Today you can buy you can buy stuff online, is what you said. By the way, in India, you can ship prayers to your loved ones abroad as well. Wow. You can buy. So what might happen is there might be a priest who will do some puja, a ceremony in your house. And what we call is prasad, is little sweets or food that is offered to a saint and then distributed in his or her name to the followers. So it's considered to be very auspicious. So there are services who do that. You can buy these items and feel good about them, but you have to pay you pay a premium. It might be shipped from, even the water of the Ganga, that is the Ganges, the river, is considered to be very auspicious. So they'll ship that. So there are all sorts of things because people believe in them. But over the years, how has magic and the Cunning Folk community evolved?
Oh yeah, that's a big question. So I think it's evolved in lots of ways, and it really depends on where you're talking about. Obviously, I focus mostly on England, so I think there's a lot more skepticism that comes in around, you know, the belief in witchcraft, basically, from the 18th century onwards. That doesn't mean that the belief in it goes away, but it does mean that, for example, the courts aren't worried about witchcraft anymore. So it stops being a crime in the 1760s, I think, 1720s, something like that. And that means that, you know, that it's a lot less present in society, or it's a lot less present in the kind of the conversations that are happening in society. But the fear of dark magic doesn't go away, and the fear and the kind of the use of white magic or kind of good magic doesn't go away either. So I think it's evolved in that it's not as mainstream as it used to be, although I think it is coming back. Like during the pandemic, we saw a lot more people using fortune tellers, for example. So it comes back occasionally, and then it kind of dies down again. I think the reason that I make the distinction between witches and cunning folk is because in the period that I look at, if you called somebody a witch, then you were saying that they were doing bad magic. You know, and that they were using demons to do it, and they were just bad people. Whereas if you said that somebody was a cunning woman or a cunning man, then you were saying that they do magic, but it's good magic, and it's not something that would be prosecuted. So when we look at things like the witch trials, we're looking at persecution of this bad magic, and often cunning folk wouldn't be persecuted alongside them. That was largely accepted. You know, it was just kind of like, it is magic. Technically, you're not meant to do it, but we all do it anyway, and that's fine. And I think that's the reason I make this difference, is because there's a big stereotype now that a witch is somebody who does good things but gets prosecuted anyway, and that isn't really what it was like. So it's more of a historical quibble. Obviously people call themselves witches now, and they see themselves as good people and they do good magic, but that's not what that word would have meant in the past. If that makes sense.
And the bad magic examples are quite scary. I think wives wanting their husbands killed, or vice versa, they would go to these cunning folk to make things happen, right? I think you cover some part of that, I think, in Revenge.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, actually, because a cunning person who offered that wouldn't necessarily be seen as particularly scary because they were performing a service. If you were just sort of throwing out curses left and right because you just didn't like people in general, and you were just doing it to people who didn't deserve it, that's when you'd be called a witch. Whereas if you were just, you know, doing things that, you know, because you were being paid for it, that wasn't seen as so bad, which is more to do with early modern morality than it is anything else. But yeah, I mean, magic is powerful. Magic can be very scary, but it can also be good. So use it wisely.
And absolutely. And last couple of questions is, how do you, storytelling, the book that you've written and across different chapters, and there is very little written about the subject out there on the internet if you start looking for it. So how do you balance the information that you have, and some part of it may or may not be true, because and you're a historian, so you'll be trained to verify, validate. Can you take me through the process of how you piece a book like this together? The process, you know, what do I include, do I not, do I have enough evidence for it to go into a book, because people will read and believe, and there is some responsibility that you might have. How do you balance that, and how do you go about it?
So it is a huge responsibility, and I felt that very strongly when I was writing it. And I struggled with it as well because, you know, I have an academic version of this book, which was published by Cambridge a few years ago, and that is a lot more detailed, and it has a lot more information about my research process and how I found the information that I have, and sort of discussing whether or not it's true and that kind of thing. And this book, basically my editor said, nobody cares about that. Stop giving us all this information. Nobody needs it, which I found really difficult. So I do try to point out when I'm guessing. So, for example, with the story of Mabel Gray, who lost her spoons, I do know I know the people that she visited, and I knew where they lived. I also have a map of London, and I try to work out the quickest and easiest route that she would have taken. So I kind of tell the story of her walking through 17th century London as best as I can with the knowledge that I have. But then I'm also very honest about the fact that I don't know whether she found the spoons. I don't know how old she was. I know very little else about her except for this one story. So it's kind of, I think, storytelling and making educated guesses, but making it clear when it is a guess, because I think that's only fair to the reader. You know, I don't want to lie.
Yeah, there is one saying, don't let truth come in the way of a good story. That's not something that we should be, especially for, it's not a fiction, book. So that in that sense, there is a lot of responsibility that comes with it.
Exactly.
Yeah, because you talked about how I'm assuming you may have had a few fights with your publisher or editor as well about what to keep, what not to, and that is a common theme among people that I have spoken to before you as well, that they sometimes have to fight for inserting a line as well in the book. I'll tell you a funny story. There is a gentleman called Alex Edmonds from the London School of Economics. He's written a book on lies and statistics, how people use data to suit their agenda and tell a story. So there he'd got a simple line there that he was talking about a person called Dave, and he says, let's call him Dave because that's his name. He had, they were all fictional, but this time he wanted to take Dave's name because it was a student. And I wrote to him that, hey, this is funny. And he said he had to fight with his publisher to retain those few words. So I'm imagining you would have had a few of those as well. Did you?
Yes, absolutely. I really did. I can't remember any particular ones off the top of my head, but I do remember, as I say, there's kind of the arguments we had about the methodology, how much I can put in, where I found my sources, putting references in as well. I wanted to put about 10,000 references, and they were like, we don't have enough pages for all of those references, please stop. Right. And I think also the general shape of the book and the message of the book, when I was talking to different publishers about it, some publishers were sort of saying, oh, we'd like it to go in this direction, we'd like you to talk about, the whole of the world, actually, kind of like a world history of magic. And I said to them, I mean, I can't do that. I don't know enough about that. I would not be able to do it justice, and it wouldn't be fair on the reader to think that I knew all about, I don't know, South African magic, for example. I don't know anything about that. So, sort of arguments at every stage, but in a good way. They were very useful. They made me a better writer, I think, and I think it ended up with an honest book as well.
Lovely. And I haven't asked this to anyone, but I'd like to know your opinion, is when you finish everything, you put in the hard work, the book is out, and you're walking by, it's somewhere evening, it could be London or anywhere else, and you walk by a bookstore and you find your book out there among others, right on the window for people to see. How is that feeling?
Love to say it feels great, but actually it just feels really strange. And every time I see it, I think, oh, I really hope everything in there is right.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, but no, I mean, it is really, really nice to see it out in the world. And it's sometimes I kind of get messages from people I've never met saying, oh, I read your book and I really enjoyed it. And that's quite humbling, I suppose, to think that there are complete strangers in the world who have read my thoughts. Feels quite special.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Tabitha, for your time on this podcast. And I hope your cat is not too cold out there and you can let him in as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.